So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions to us the different reasons why Iblis rejected, why Shaytan refused to prostrate. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He does that for several reasons. Number one, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala highlights to us the elements of Shaytan's character that are relevant to the story he's telling. So usually, for example, if we're talking about Bani Israel, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala starts to mention the aspect of pride. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would mention the ingratitude of Iblis or Shaytan. So whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about, in essence, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will place the story of Iblis, the story of Shaytan, in that context. Now, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the different names of Shaytan, we also see that there's a miracle in the Quran. Now, just quickly, the word Iblis is the name of the devil. The word Iblis means one who has lost all hope from receiving the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Someone who's hopeless, who's helpless. Okay? He's turned away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala altogether, and he's completely lost hope in receiving the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And like the people in the hereafter, who would be mublisun, who would be completely, devoid of any form of hope once they enter into that station for having followed Iblis. So Iblis is the ultimate hopeless creature of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses Iblis's name as Iblis, when He calls him Iblis in the Quran, it tends to be when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is referencing Iblis's own disobedience. Now Shaytan, on the other hand, and there are many shayateen, Shaytan isn't just exclusive to this particular devil, but Shaytan means any devil. Ash-Shaytan, the Shaytan, is referring to Iblis himself. Shaytan comes from the word shatana, which means to dig yourself deeper, to distance yourself and dig yourself deeper. So a deep well would be called shatun, okay? When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses ash-Shaytan to describe him, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is usually referring to his plots and his deception. Okay, so Iblis is more exclusive to him. Shaytan is more inclusive to everything that he does to everyone else, to everything, to how he keeps distancing himself from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by taking mankind away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and insisting on his disobedience. Now, what is the real reason why he turned away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Why didn't he prostrate? Why didn't he make sujood? Number one, we find that Iblis first had the disease of hasad, envy. When did he have that disease of hasad and envy? From the time that he heard Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say, "Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa," that I'm going to place a successor on the earth, because Iblis knew that his species, that the creation of the jinn, were incapable of that. So knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had chosen other than him to be in charge of the earth, Iblis developed a sense of hasad. He developed a sense of envy. Then once he saw the creation of Adam alayhi salam, he developed a greater disease, which is the disease of kibr, the disease of pride, the mother of all evils. And this is something that the scholars of tazkiyah, of spirituality, often speak about. That many times the degree of the sin that's being described, that's being discussed, is not that grave, or it could be very grave, but the disease that it tells you about, or the disease that's behind that disease, the sin that sin leads to, could actually be bigger. And so kibr is the worst of them all, the mother of all diseases. Iblis developed that when he finally saw Adam alayhi salam and his creation, and Iblis felt like he was better than him. Iblis felt like he was of a greater degree of piety, a greater in his sense of creation, and so on and so forth. Now, what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala highlight in the Quran when Allah talks about his refusal to prostrate to Adam? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِذْ قُلْنَا لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ اسْجُدُوا لِآدَمَ فَسَجَدُوا إِلَّا إِبْلِيسَ كَانَ مِنَ الْجِنِّ فَفَسَقَ عَنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّهِ. First, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that when we said to the angels to prostrate to Adam alayhi salam, they all did except for Iblis. Now in the Arabic language, this istithna, this saying except for Iblis, does not necessarily mean he was an angel, but instead he was amongst the angels, as we've already established. But Allah says, كَانَ مِنَ الْجِنِّ فَفَسَقَ عَنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّهِ. He was from the jinn, and that's why he was capable of disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah wants to highlight the fact that he's a jinn to show that he's mukhayyar, that he has free will, as opposed to the angels. So he can disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala technically, as opposed to the angels who cannot. So this automatically sets us apart from the Christians and the Jews in that sense, from a theological perspective. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, after establishing that Iblis is mukhayyar, that Iblis had the choice, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قَالَ يَا إِبْلِيسُ مَا مَنَعَكَ أَن تَسْجُدَ لِمَا خَلَقْتُ بِيَدَيَّ أَسْتَكْبَرْتَ أَمْ كُنْتَ مِنَ الْعَالِينَ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, what prevented you from prostrating to that which I created with my hands? Did you find kibr in yourself, or did you find yourself from being amongst the exalted, from al-alin? Now these things here, istakbarta, am kunta min al-alin, these two things here are actually different categories. Allah gives us two possibilities here for Iblis abstaining from sujood. Number one, istakbarta, okay? Astakbarta. Did you find pride in yourself? Did you find yourself too good? Istakbarta means istakbarta an sujood. Did you find yourself too good to prostrate and put your face on the ground? Al-alin, okay, am kunta min al-alin, or did you find yourself to be amongst the exalted, means do you find yourself to be better than the rest of the angels? So Allah mentions two possibilities, and they are two different categories of pride that are both destructive. The first one is that the action is beneath you. The second one is that the others are beneath you. Okay? And Iblis is guilty of both. Astakbarta am kunta min al-alin. Now Iblis, to look at the second piece of this, which is really the underestimated piece. Isti'la am kunta min al-alin. Did you find yourself to be amongst the exalted? Why would Iblis feel that way? Because Iblis was the highest of the angels. Or he was high, he was placed at a position amongst the highest of the angels because he worshipped Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for thousands of years, despite, having free will, despite being mukhayyar. And just as we said earlier that, that human beings surpass the rank of the angels when they choose to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Iblis was at a greater rank. So Iblis thought that he was better than the angels, okay? And he found kibr within himself. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, and it's very powerful, Allah responded to his kibr by saying, فَخْرُجْ إِنَّكَ مِنَ الصَّاغِرِينَ. That get out, you are amongst the smallest of them. إِنَّكَ مِنَ الصَّاغِرِينَ, not the smallest of the angels. You are amongst the most belittled and despised of all of my creatures. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala belittled him due to his kibr. And that's what it is here. The more humble you are in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the greater Allah makes you. Whereas the more arrogant and prideful you are, the more Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala belittles you. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions to us some examples of isti'la here. This idea of feeling greater than the rest of them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَاكُمْ ثُمَّ صَوَّرْنَاكُمْ ثُمَّ قُلْنَا لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ اسْجُدُوا لِآدَمَ فَسَجَدُوا إِلَّا إِبْلِيسَ لَمْ يَكُنْ مِنَ السَّاجِدِينَ. So first, Iblis was the one that would not make sujood because he refused to be amongst those that prostrate. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues. In another ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِلَّا إِبْلِيسَ أَبَى أَن يَكُونَ مَعَ السَّاجِدِينَ قَالَ يَا إِبْلِيسُ مَا لَكَ أَلَّا تَكُونَ مَعَ السَّاجِدِينَ. So Iblis said, I'm not going to be amongst all of those, right? So he thought, hey, these angels are less than me, so I'm not going to be amongst them. So Iblis had kibr, not just with Adam alayhi salam, Iblis even had pride with the angels, which shows you how destructive this pride can become. And then when it came to Adam alayhi salam, finally Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the pride in that which he was created from. Why? Because the essence of Iblis's pride, what started it in the first place, was his religious pride, which shows you how dangerous it can become when you become judgmental and you start to become self-righteous. Okay, and self-righteousness leads to being judgmental in the first place. But what ends up happening is that you start to have pride in other ways as well. So Iblis was, he really took pride in his ibadah, but then Iblis, when he sees Adam alayhi salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, he said, قَالَ أَأَسْجُدُ لِمَنْ خَلَقْتَ طِينًا. You want me to prostrate to the one that you've created from dirt? So it led him to belittle Adam alayhi salam in every way. It led him to racism. And just like racism, racism is a nasty disease in and of itself, right? But racism can also indicate a form of pride and shirk. It can also indicate a form of shirk. It can, of disbelief. Why? Because you think that Allah has made you inherently better than someone else. And there's nothing more satanic than that.